Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitchin, and this is Block 5 of our Parables Quilt-Along series. Block 5 is the parable of the wise and foolish builder. It's a 4-inch block in our finished quilt, but you don't have to set it in the quilt. We do have alternative setting instructions that you can use for other projects as well. The 2 blocks that you see that I have finished here will be appearing in my finished quilt. So I'm going to make sure that the fabrics coordinate nicely with my Jesus the Teacher, which is the centerpiece of my quilt. All right, if you would please join me in prayer. Merciful Father, you have shown me that my old life is gone and my new life is found with you. I'm thankful not to dwell on my past mistakes and relive those awful times. I'm thankful to follow you and the path that you have created for me. Like your disciples, I pray I will share the good news of new life in Christ with everyone. Allow me to shine the light of Christ so others will draw closer to you. Amen. Let's take a look at the pattern. On page 1 of the pattern, in the upper left-hand corner, I have the fabric requirements and the cutting instructions. This is such a small block that you'll be able to use scraps if you choose for this particular block. In the center, I have the parable from Matthew 7:24 through 27 of the wise and foolish builders. And you can read that parable in any of the Bibles that you would have at home. At the bottom of the pattern, I include a devotional message about the parable. And at the very bottom, I have a prayer, short prayer that you can say as you complete your block. On page 2 of the pattern, I include all of the instructions, including the pressing instructions for making this block. This is such a small block, it's important that you measure your units and that they measure what the pattern calls for, so that when you put it together, it all fits nicely. Page 3 of the pattern has a little indication as to why I chose a house to represent this particular parable, and a place at the bottom for you to write your own personal reflection. You could consider your personal faith experience with this parable or reflect on your quilting or faith journey. Just a place for you to jot down some of your own thoughts. Let's take a look at fabric choices. For this particular block, it's a very small block, so make sure that your background doesn't have too loud of a print. It needs to read nearly solid, so I've chosen this real small tone on tone for my background. You have an opportunity with the roof. Choose a fun fabric, maybe something that would look kind of like a shingle. So for that, I've chosen this turquoise and green. Looks a little bit like a rounded shingle. Once I chose that, I chose this fabric for my house. Now you'll note that it's directional, so I need to be careful when I'm cutting my house units that I'm cutting them so that the direction of the fabric goes the way that I want it. I need to have a door in the unit, and so I chose this green. It kind of pulls out the green. But the most important thing is to consider, how does this fabric look with your large cross in the event that you're choosing to put this together in one large quilt. The fabrics I chose for my alternate setting, I chose simply because I thought they were fun and they'd look nice in my car. Again, I chose a fabric for my roof that kind of had a shingle look. I chose my background fabrics, and then from there I chose the rest. I placed a red door on this particular house because I thought it looked welcoming. As I begin cutting for this unit, I'm going to start by cutting my selvage off. It's really important to remove your selvage so that it doesn't somehow end up in one of your little blocks. A selvage can really mess up the overall look by increasing the shrinkage where the selvage fabric is. So I'll just remove that risk by taking the selvage off and discarding it before I start. When cutting my fabric, I like to choose a mat that really offsets the fabric. So in this case, I'm cutting light fabric. I've chosen a black mat. I always use my ruler to make my cuts, not the mat, because the mat's measurements are not necessarily always accurate. I like to use a ruler where I can see the the fabric beneath the marked lines on the ruler. This one happens to be a Marty Michelle ruler that has great 1/8" markings, but it also has, you can see, a gap in between each marking on the ruler. That allows me to see my fabric, and so that I don't make the mistake of not being able to see exactly where I'm making my cut because the mark is too wide. This pattern calls for some 2.5" units in the background. So I know that I can easily make a small strip of 2.5 inches. I can use it on this particular pattern, and I'll use it again in the rest of the quilt somewhere else. So that's a nice size for me to cut and just have on hand. My house fabric that I've chosen has a directional print to it. So I need to make sure that I'm cutting my units so they go in the direction that I want to. I want them to look like downward facing triangles on the house itself. So I'm going to make sure that I have this be the width of the unit that I want to cut, which is 3 inches. So I'll cut my unit here that's 3 inches. And then from that, I'll subcut the unit that I need for the actual cross beam of the house. I can cut my other units out of the remaining pieces. I have the opportunity now to fussy cut this unit so I can get as many triangles and color into my house unit that I can. And I think the unit that I want to choose is right there. So I'm going to give myself 1/4 inch seam allowance there. And then I'm going to subcut my 1¼ by 3 inch piece. It's already 3 inches wide, and I'll cut it to 1¼ inches. There is my house unit. My door will fit right in between there. With my roof units, I could cut doubles because I'm cutting for 2 blocks, but because it has such a fun little design to it, I'm going to actually fussy cut my units so that my shingles look the way I want them to in the overall look, because it's not exactly the same on the fabric underneath as it is on the fabric on top. When I'm stitching a small block together like this, I like to lay it out on a cutting mat first. I look ahead at the instructions and the cutting pieces that I already have, and I like to lay it out on a mat first like a puzzle to make sure I have all the pieces and I get it straight in my head what I'm going to be sewing where. Because with such small pieces, I don't want to unsew any of these units. Okay, I have them all laid out. I make sure I've got the right number of units, and I'm ready to go ahead and sew this block together. Beginning with the first instruction, it tells you that we're going to make a flying geese unit with our roof and our background fabrics. You can choose to mark your background fabrics with a ruler and a marking pencil to mark your diagonal that you're going to sew on. Or you can choose to press the unit. Now you're going to mark the diagonal on the wrong side of the fabric. By the same token, if you're going to use a pressing method, you're going to press with wrong sides together. Fold that square in half diagonally, finger press it first, and then with wrong sides together, I'll press that unit, holding it in place for 5 seconds. And I'm using a dry iron. If you use steam, it will introduce stretch into your unit, and we don't want that. So I can choose to sew on a marked line or on a pressed line, either way. I always begin with a beginner or an ender so that I don't start out with a fabric nest underneath my unit. And beginning with the roof unit, I'll place the square in the corner of my rectangle roof unit. It's such a small piece, you do not have to use pins, but you're welcome to pin it in place if you want to. And I'll be sewing along that pressed or marked line. Now, typically with a flying geese unit, if you were only making one block, you'd have to take it out of your machine and trim before moving on to the next step. But in this case, I'm making 2 blocks, so I'm going to go ahead and chain piece those. The pattern calls for you to trim 1/4 inch outside of that seam line. I like to use a ruler that has a nice straight 1/4 inch for me to follow, and I'll place it the 1/4 inch mark right on that seam line and then just trim. I've got 2 units, so I'll do it with my second unit as well. The pattern further calls for us to press to the outside. So I'll grab my pressing mat, set it in place. I'll begin by setting the seam with a nice hot iron, holding in place for 5 seconds. And then I'll just press it to the outside. Now I had pressed my diagonal seams, so it makes them already want to press to the outside because I've already pressed that diagonal into place. Now I'll stitch the second half of the unit on in the very same fashion. I'm going to place my square in the corner of the rectangle, and you'll note that these slightly overlap. That's going to be necessary in order for us to catch that 1/4 inch seam there. I'll take it to my machine, and exactly as I did before, I'm just going to run them through my machine on that diagonal line. I'm ready to move on to step 2. So I'm going to place my roof units back on my little design palette here. And on step 2, I'm taking the side walls of the house and I'm stitching them to either side of the door unit. So I'm making sure that I have my 1 3/4 inch sides matching up with my door unit. And this is your chance to make sure that if you're using directional fabric to make sure it's going the right direction, or that if you have a particular feature in the door, like in this case, I think I want my door to have the swirl at the top, make sure you have your units in place before you stitch them. You're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam on both sides, and you're going to press those to the outside. To press the door and house units to the outside, you're first going to want to set the seams, and you have to do that by holding the part of the house unit out of the way. I'll set this seam, turn my unit over, hold the house out of the way, and set the other seam. By doing that, it helps it to make sure it stays nice and straight. Then I'm going to open my unit, hold it with my fingers, and I'm first going to finger press those. Just using my thumbnail or my fingernail so that you can see that I'm giving it some tension to pull to the outside, and I'm just going to set the iron on top for 5 seconds. That way my unit stays nice and straight both horizontally and vertically. The pattern indicates that this unit should measure 3 inches wide. And so I go ahead and I measure to make sure that I am at 3 inches. Looks like my measurements came out fine. I'm ready to move on to the next step. Put my door unit back in place on my mat. Again, so I can see that I have my directions going the right direction. You can see I had to turn that one over. Got my swirl where I want it there. And in step 3, I'm going to take this top of the house unit and I'm going to stitch it to this. And I'm just going to fold it over like a sandwich. I'm going to line up my ends. Again, this unit is so small you won't need a pin. But if you feel more comfortable pinning, go right ahead. And then I'm going to make sure I sew it at a 1/4 inch. The pattern calls for this unit to be pressed toward the header. So I'll set it on my mat, set the seam with my hot iron, and press toward that header unit, holding it in place for 5 seconds. I'll go back to my design mat, lay it back in place to make sure, because in this case I have directional fabric, make sure that all of my fabric's going the direction that it's supposed to. Looks good. I'm ready to move on to the next step. In the next step, I'm going to take the background pieces, fold them over like a sandwich onto my unit, hit a 1/4 inch and press to the outside. It's time to press the background fabric. We'll begin by setting the seam and then press to the outside, holding in place for 5 seconds. When I'm setting a seam, whatever fabric is going to be pressed toward, I have that fabric on top. Makes it easiest for me when I'm pressing. And you'll note too that I turned my unit around as I'm pressing. You don't have to do that, but I find that it makes it so that I press both sides exactly the same way when I turn the unit around and press them the same way. Now my unit is nice and rectangular, and the pattern says that it should measure 2.5 inches high by 4.5 inches wide. And mine measures the exact measurement that the pattern calls for, so I'll be ready to add my roof unit. Time to add our roof units. They also should measure 4.5 inches wide. I'll fold it over like a sandwich and pin each of those edges. That way I make sure that my roof is centered perfectly. You don't need to put a pin in the center, but you're sure welcome to if you like. Once I have the house stitched to the roof unit, the pattern calls for you to press towards the house. So the house is on top. I set the seam. Flip that house unit over and press, holding for 5 seconds. There is my house built on a solid foundation. I measure it to make sure that it measures 4.5 inches square. And one last thing I like to do is I like to edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch around the square, around the unit, because I'll be moving this around a lot as I continue to work on my full quilt. If you're going to just use it as a single block and you've got your setting ready for that, you don't need to edge stitch, but it's just wise to make sure that all of those seams get set in place about 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch. And there I have my finished block 5 Wise and Foolish Builders that finishes at 4 inches. So this measures 4.5 inch unfinished. And I have edge stitched around mine. So I'll hold that up nice and close, so you can see that stitching at about 1/16 of an inch all the way around those units. That way, there we go. Now you can see those edge stitch along those edges. That way it holds the seams in place and keeps it nice and square in case I'm going to be moving these blocks around quite a bit. Okay, I have my finished blocks for these units. Let's go ahead and just lay them on the initial cross section to see how they look. And it looks like they're going to look really quite nicely with them. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send me an email, post a message on our Facebook page. All the contact information is at the end of this video. I thank you and have a blessed day.